All right, we're in the book of Job tonight, and you should have 2 sheets of paper. You got your survey note sheet, and you have a handout. And you're going to be really thankful that I put this together for you, or actually that Harold Remington put it together for you. And I got it in this format with the help of Mr. Young. And so let's take our Bibles and go to the book of Job. The book of Job. Now, we have just completed our study of what is known as the historical books of the Bible. Now we're entering a new section of the Bible, and it's called the poetic books, right? The poetic books. It's also known as wisdom literature in the Bible. Now, the thing about English poetry is that how do we know when we're reading English poetry? It what? Rhymes, right? You did so good answering that. I appreciate all the outspoken people tonight. And so, roses are red, violets are blue, la, 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 la. I'll let you finish it, okay? And that's English poetry. Parallelism of sound. Hebrew poetry does not have parallelism of sound. By the way, it's not written in English originally. It's translated into English, right? So even if it did rhyme, we wouldn't know it. But it's based on parallelism of thought. Parallelism of thought. So, for example, when you read the Proverbs, you'll read statements that complement one another. Essentially, they say the same thing in a different way. Or you'll read statements that contrast one another, okay? And the reason that is to drive home the point. To drive home the point. And so here we've come to this section of books known as the poetic books, also known as wisdom literature, all right? Now, the first book in this section is the book of Job, the book of Job. And I want us to turn there, okay? Let's read Job chapter number 1. And we'll get the setting. There was a man, Job chapter 1, verse 1, there was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. His substance was also 7,000 sheep, and 3,000 camels, and 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the men of the east. And his sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and to drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus did Job continually. So we know that Job was a blessed man. He was wealthy. He had a wonderful family. He was devoted to God. He feared God. He eschewed evil. That meant that he avoided the path of evil. This was who Job was. Job, the Bible calls him in verse 1, a perfect and upright man, one that feared God and eschewed evil. Perfect does not mean what we would interpret today as perfect, meaning sinless. He was not sinless by any means, but he was unblameable, all right? There was nothing glaring in his life that one could point to and say, Job, he's a good guy, but he's got a problem with this and a problem with that. No, Job was the kind of man that you had confidence in, okay? And so we meet Job. Now in verse 6, the scene shifts, okay? And we go up into the presence of the Lord. Now, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, "Whence comest thou?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it." And the Lord said unto Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. So what do we find here is we find that Job was not only viewed as a perfect and upright man by those on earth, but the Lord himself vouched for the character and devotion of Job. And so God says to the devil, have you considered my servant Job? The devil has come before the Lord. The sons of God, who are the sons of God? They are the angelic beings, and they are accountable to God. And among them are Satan and his hosts. And so Satan comes before the Lord. And God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him. And the Bible says in verse 9, Satan answered the Lord and said, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So we have the scene on earth. We're introduced to Job. Here's a wise man, a devoted man, a godly man, a family man, a businessman. He's a great man, the greatest of the East. And then we go to heaven, and the angelic beings are coming before God, giving an account for their activities, and Satan comes before God. And the Lord asked him, have you considered my servant Job? And then Satan essentially says this. He says, does Job fear you for naught? In other reasons, you want to hold Job up as an example of being devoted to you? Now remember, who wasn't devoted to him? Well, Satan wasn't, right? Because Satan rebelled against God. He did not want to bow the knee in submission to God. He rebelled against God. He said, God, you're not worthy of worship. I won't worship. And because of his pride and his insolence and his rebellion, he fell. So he's the leader of the band of the rebellious bunch. That's all of us, right? And he's presenting himself to God, and God says, hey, there's one down there who isn't rebelling against me. His name is Job. He loves me. He's devoted to me. He will give me what you wouldn't. He will give me worship. And here's what the devil said essentially to God. God, the reason he does that is because you take such good care of him. In other words, you have put a hedge about him, you've protected him, you've blessed him. Look at all that you've given him. He's got the wonderful family, he's got the perfect wife, and no wonder he serves you. But if you will let me touch him, if you'll let me ruin him, essentially, then here's what he's going to do. He's going to curse you to your face. Now, he's calling into question the character of Job, no doubt. But really, the character that he's calling into question is the character of God. Because the question then comes, is God worthy of worship? Do we bow to God for who he is, or do we bow to God for what he does for us? And if it's conditional on what he does for us, then it's idolatry, is it not? Because we have concluded that we're the ones that God must please. But worship is pleasing God, not pleasing ourselves. So this is the dilemma that is unfolding in a drama before us in the book of Job. So when we come to the thought or the question of who the author is, what do we know? Well, we know the author is unnamed. No author is named in this book. Now, there are some suggestions and some clues that it could possibly have been Job, but many believe that he's an unlikely candidate. Perhaps stronger suggestions would say Moses could have written this book. And that certainly is true. Moses could have written this book because the events that unfold, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, the events that unfold in the book of Job are events that coincide with the book of Genesis and the patriarchal age. So Moses is one suggestion. In fact, Moses, during his time in Midian, that 40-year time in the wilderness, was very near to the land of Uz. That doesn't mean that Moses knew about this story. It just simply means perhaps he may have heard it or gotten a record of it in some fashion. Another suggestion is that Solomon may have written the book of Job, because Solomon is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, and there are many similarities with the book of Job and with portions of Ecclesiastes. Again, in style, they're both what we would classify as wisdom literature. Okay? So we do not know who the author is, or the human penman. We know who the author is. That's the Lord. The occasion, I know in John MacArthur's book, or his commentary, he has a brief commentary on the Bible that looks at each book. That was a great resource if you'd like to get it. But in fact, I'll just need to get the name for you to make sure that you know exactly what to get. But it's a lot like Wiersbe's Expository Outlines, or Baxter's book, or even the book that Wilmington wrote on his guide to the Bible. It's similar in concept to that. But MacArthur notes some things in his commentary about the time that it was written. And the conclusion is that most likely it records events that probably unfolded after the flood, but before Genesis chapter 12, when God called Abraham. So you might say, well, this happened somewhere around Genesis 11 and before Genesis 12, okay? Now, there's some reasons that is believed. For example, Job's age. Most people believe, the Bible teaches that he lived 140 years after this trial came to him, and so most believe he lived about 200 years, a little over. And if you study the life expectancy of men from the time of creation to the time of the flood, and then beyond into the time of Abraham, you're going to find that his life expectancy was corresponding to that time period. Another reason is because of the way that his wealth is measured in livestock, which would have been a common way in which wealth would have been measured in the patriarchal age. Another indication of this is that Job had priestly functions with his family. He was the priest of his family. He offered the sacrifices. So there's no mention of Abraham, no mention of Israel, or the Exodus, or the law. And so that would lead us to conclude then somewhere around Genesis 11, Genesis 12. So as far as its time period, really, Job is the most ancient book of the Bible. It's the most ancient book of the Bible. Remember now, Moses wrote years and years later. And so this would be the most ancient book of the Bible covering this most ancient story. All right, so the human penman, we don't know exactly who that is. There's some suggestions have been made, and the occasion somewhere in the time period between Genesis 11 and Genesis 12. The theme of the book is suffering, the suffering of the righteous, the suffering of the righteous. It is clearly indicated in the beginning of this book on two occasions in the first few verses that we read that both men and God viewed Job as a righteous man. There was nothing evident or glaring in his life that you could point to as a fault in the life of the man. He was a man who feared God and eschewed evil. That's the theme. What did Job demonstrate? Well, he demonstrated to the devil and all the hosts of heaven and hell that God was worthy of the worship that he received. He demonstrated that God was worthy, okay? That was really what was at stake here, the worthiness of God. And he's worthy for who he is, not simply for what he does. All right? Now let's think about the outline, and that's where I really feel like this will come into hand for you. And so let's look together at this sheet, this handout. And I think we can just go through that tonight. It'll save you a lot of writing. How many of you would like to write all these things down? Yeah. Right. No hands up. And how many of you are glad you don't have to write these things down? How many of you men are glad your wife doesn't have to write these things down? Yeah. That's right. Here I am giving you a hard time. I shouldn't do that, should I? This is the last time we meet before we take a little break. So I should be nice tonight. I should be filled with Christmas cheer, right? And so I am. I've given you the handout. And so there we go. All right, so let's look at it. First of all, the first section here identified by Wilmington, and I get this from Wilmington's Guide to the Bible. Again, a very helpful resource. It has a lot of charts and just a unique way of presenting things to kind of help you encapsulate the message. But the first thing he has here is his terrible trials, Job's terrible trials. And they truly were terrible, weren't they? Let's look at it in chapter 1 and verse 13. There was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger unto Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So Job got up that morning, he went to the office, or maybe he went to the barn. He has an office in the barn where he runs the farm of Job, and here comes a guy in, and he says, this is what happened. Now, look at verse 16. While he was yet speaking, while he was getting this news from this guy who had escaped to tell him, there came also another. So this guy's telling the story. The door opens. Job sees the guy coming in. He sees the worried, distressed look on this guy's face. This man's telling him the bad news. And then as soon as he's done, here comes this other gentleman now beginning to lift his voice. And he said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven and hath burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now, by the way, it wasn't the fire of God that fell. It wasn't the fire of God that fell, but that was the man's idea. So all the sheep had been burned up in a fire. While he was yet speaking, there came also another. So here's the third guy that somehow made himself into the barn and into the office. And he says, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. I mean, have you had a bad day? This is a bad day, right? While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons, this is where the day gets really bad. Thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. And said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. Amazing, isn't it? But what happens next? Again, verse 1 of chapter 2, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said unto Satan, from whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down in it. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? Here he goes. Have you considered Job? Now, Job didn't know this conversation took place. But if he did, he'd probably say, Lord, just forget about me. Don't bring me up to the devil, right? There's none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil, and still he holdeth fast his integrity. Although thou movest me against him to destroy him, would you say those next two words? Without what? Without cause. Why did Job suffer? Without cause. What did Job do to deserve this? Nothing. Nothing. And that's our dilemma, isn't it? In fact, that becomes the dilemma throughout the rest of the book. And there are three guys who show up at Job's house who try to tell him why he is suffering. And they all three got it wrong. In fact, there's a fourth that joins in, and he's got part of it right, but he doesn't have it all right, so he got it wrong too. And Job's trying to defend himself in all of this, and guess what he did? He got it wrong. Then finally, God comes in, and God had it right. Verse 4, and Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life, but put forth thine hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. So here's the devil's same claim. Okay, all right. He withstood the test, but let me touch his body. Let me afflict him. Let it touch him. Because really, we didn't touch him last time, Lord, just other things. But let me touch him, and when I do, he'll curse you to your face. And the Lord said unto Satan, behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. So let's see what happens. Verse 7. So when went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils, and from the sole of his foot unto his crown. And he took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Then said his wife unto him, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. But he said unto her, thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. So what did Job do? He didn't dishonor the Lord, did he? So there's a battle going on between Satan and the Lord, and God's going to win the battle. And God's going to get the glory. Because Satan and all the demonic hosts, along with the angels and all of the hosts of heaven, are going to see in the end that God is truly, not that there was ever a debate about it, but that man, sinful man, truly loves God and desires to worship him. That bothers the devil. By the way, if you love the Lord tonight and you want to worship him and honor him, that bothers the devil. And he would love nothing more than to tamper with that, to draw you away from the Lord, to entice you, to frustrate you, to persecute you, to afflict you. This is the work of Satan against God's children today. And he does so to hurt and harm God. And so this was in his heart, this was in his mind, this is what he wanted to do. God knew that. God knew that. God knew what the devil was thinking. And so God is going to get glory through the suffering of Job. And here's one thing we can learn tonight, is that God will get glory through our suffering. We can learn too that God is worthy of our worship no matter what good comes or what evil comes to our lives. God is worthy of our worship. So his terrible trials, and you see them, they're outlined there. And if you look at the background of the trials, Job's motives for worshiping God have been challenged by Satan, and so God allowed those trials to come. His wife then, of course, was like putting the whipped cream on top of Satan's cake. Curse God and die. All right, so then we move into chapter 3, and the friends have come. We see this in chapter 2, actually in verse 11. but the speeches begin in chapter 3. And what you have from chapter 3 to, I think it's chapter 37, are a series of speeches that are delivered, okay? And the speeches are delivered by Job and his fickle friends, all right? So we meet the fickle friends, and they're introduced to us. Eliphaz is the first, Bildad is the second, and then Zophar is listed, and then finally, he doesn't show up until chapter 32, or he doesn't speak up until chapter 32, is Elihu, okay? So what you have from chapter 3 through chapter 37 are a series of speeches made by men who are considered to be wise men, the wise men of the East, okay? Remember, there's no television, right? And there's no mass forms of communication. And so people in that day, in that culture, would gather to hear wise men speak. And can you imagine how wise they were? I mean, they lived for long periods of time. And so they acquired great wisdom, no doubt. And they benefited from knowing people like Noah, who had lived on both sides of the flood and who had witnessed and heard the stories of the patriarchs. And so these men were filled with great wisdom, so they would gather and they would make these speeches, and people would come to hear their wisdom. Well, here comes these three guys. They find out that the greatest man in the East has been afflicted in such a dreadful way, so they all come to speak to him. And it begins in chapter 3 when Job finally speaks. Because when these guys showed up in chapter 2 and verse 13, they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. And there's something we can learn here, is when we don't know what to say, we don't have to say anything. You know, I would go see this person, or I go to the funeral home, or I go to the hospital, and what do I say to them? You just tell them you love them and you're praying for them. You don't have to have answers because you don't have them, right? And these guys knew that, man, this grief that Job is suffering is so unbelievable. It's so difficult what he's gone through. For 7 days, they kept quiet. Finally, in chapter 3 and verse 1, Job opens his mouth. And he begins to question, why has this happened to me? Do you feel like that's a legitimate question tonight? If this happened to you, you lost everything you possessed, your children were all killed in a tragic storm, and now you have this dreadful disease that has afflicted you. Your wife has essentially forsaken you and said, curse God and die. Let me ask you, would you ask God why? Yes. It's a natural human response. And so Job begins to say, I wish I'd never been born. Why is it that God is doing this to me? There was nothing that I really did to deserve this. So what is happening here? And really, that's our dilemma in the midst of suffering. We want answers. We want answers. We want to know, why did God allow this? Or why did this happen? So these three guys are there, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. So we're going to look at them individually, and you see through the handout that Eliphaz's speeches are recorded for us. He makes 3. They're recorded in chapters 4 and 5, also chapter 15, and also chapter 22. Each of them have a premise or a viewpoint that is behind their argument against Job. And by the way, all of them have the same argument. Job, you are suffering because of your sin. They could not rationalize his suffering apart from there must have been a cause. And their entire worldview was this: if you're suffering, then God is punishing you for your sin. God is punishing you for your sin. And so Eliphaz, his viewpoint then is based on his personal experience. His personal experience. Notice in chapter 4 and verse number 8, in his speech, Eliphaz says, even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God, they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils are they consumed. The roaring of the lion and the voice of the fierce lion and the teeth of the young lion are broken. The old lion perisheth for lack of prey, and the stout lion's whelps are scattered abroad. Now a thing was secretly brought to me, and mine ear received a little thereof. In thoughts from the visions of the night, when the deep sleep falleth upon men, fear came upon me. And you can read the remainder of that vision. But here's what he's saying. This is what I have seen. This is what I have experienced. Job, you are suffering because of your sin. Then he makes some accusations in chapter 22. And what you're going to realize as you read the speeches of these three guys is that they get frustrated with Job. They say, Job, you're suffering. Why are you questioning God? It's obvious that you've sinned. And then Job defends his integrity. And then here's what happens. That blows apart their worldview. That blows apart their reasoning and their logic. And so the way they respond to that is by becoming more harsh in their argument against Job. So in chapter 22 and verse 6, if you look at your notes there, he says, you've cheated the poor. In verse 7, you've not fed the hungry. In verse 9, you've mistreated widows and orphans. He calls him a windbag in chapter 15 and verse 2. So what does he conclude then that Job ought to do? He ought to repent and turn back to God. That's his argument. Job, you're suffering because of your sin. I've seen it happen. When people suffer, it's because of sin in their lives. All right, so now we move to Bildad. Now these speeches aren't happening consecutively. They're interwoven. All right, Eliphaz will speak, then Bildad will speak, then Zophar will speak. Job is speaking throughout, and then that cycle will repeat itself 2 more times. But we're just summarizing their arguments. Bildad then makes his speeches in chapter 8, 18, and 25. His viewpoint, his worldview, and his argument is based on tradition. Tradition. So let's look at it. Chapter 8, verses 8 through 10. For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday and know nothing, because our days upon the earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee and tell thee and utter words out of their heart? So here's what he's saying. Look back on the past and what the aged men of wisdom have told us. And here's the argument, again the same, you are suffering because of your sin. His advice then is repent and turn back to God. Okay? So that's Eliphaz, Bildad. Then we come to the next is Zophar. Everybody following me, Zophar? All right, good. Some of you got that. Some of you still trying to wake up. I know, I get it. I'm with you. Zophar makes 2 speeches, chapter 11 and verse 20. His viewpoint is dogmatism. He is dogmatic. Have you ever met anybody that's dogmatic? This guy is dogmatic. He knows why he's suffering, and he knows that he knows. Okay? He's dogmatic. He is certain. He is sure of himself. Look at chapter 11 and verse number 6. And that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom, and that they are double to that which is. Know, therefore, that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. Job, God's let you off the hook a little bit here. And you can know it, he says. You can know it. Look at chapter 20. Chapter 20 and verse number 4. He's a really confident guy. Knowest thou not this of old, since man was placed upon the earth? So Zophar is dogmatic. Here's his argument. Job, you are suffering because of your sin. His advice is to repent and turn back to God. Okay. By the way, you remember what Job called these guys? The miserable comforters, right? I mean, they came to comfort him, but they condemned him. They condemned him. Elihu then interrupts in chapter 32. He's perceived to be a younger man, and perhaps this is the reason he hasn't spoken up until this point. And Elihu was confident. He thought that he was the answer to Job's problem. That was his viewpoint. Job, here I am. I have the answer. And really, he believes that he has received revelation. He has some revelation from God. So let's look at it in chapter 33 and verse 6. Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. That's what your husband said, right, ladies? I am your wish, and I'm the one you hope for. I'm the one you dreamed about. Here I am. This is a tough crowd tonight. Let me just tell you, it's a tough crowd. He said, I'm God's gift to you. Behold, I am according to thy wish in God's stead. I also am formed out of the clay. Listen, don't get too carried away. I'm just a man like you, but I'm the guy that God sent to give you the answer. You ever met anybody like that? Sure, we've met all four of these guys, haven't we? Right. Different names, different faces, but we know them. His conclusion is that Job was guilty of foolish speaking, that Job was guilty of a false righteousness, and that God's glory and greatness should be considered. He did introduce the concept that God was perhaps chastening Job, while not necessarily punishing him for all his sins, but was chastening him. So here we have the debates dealing with the dilemma of why people suffer trying to solve problems. Now, throughout these speeches, Job gives his defenses and dialogues. That's the next section. And there are 9 separate speeches, and they're recorded in those chapters that are listed there, beginning with chapter 3 all the way through 31. And Job discusses 14 topics. 14 topics. He discusses righteousness and suffering. He discusses good works, health, wealth, and respect, unfair punishment, so-called friends, if you were in my place or if they were in my place, false neighbors, associates, and servants, answers, God, the flesh, I wish I'd never been born, I wish I were dead, I have no hope, in spite of all, I'll trust God. Sounds like he's all over the place, isn't he? Sounds just like us, doesn't it? Do you get all over the place? Why did this happen? What's God doing to me? I wish I'd never been born. I wish this had never happened. These people claim to be my friends, but they're not. I don't have any hope. Well, I'm hoping in God. You see, he's a man. He's suffering, he's hurting, he's under pressure. He's being attacked by the devil and by his friends. And he's trying to make sense of it all. Who hasn't spoken yet? God. God. Well, then we come to the next point then. Who speaks? God speaks. We see his glorious God, right? So God comes into the conversation now. All that time, Job was tempted to think what? God doesn't care, he's not watching. But he was watching every step of the way, wasn't he? And now he's going to speak. And the good news is for us is we don't have to wait on him to speak. He's already spoken. He's just waiting on us to listen. But now God speaks. Out of the whirlwind came the mighty voice of God. Can you imagine that? And God has a series of questions, 6 of them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? All right, all you smart guys, you think you got it all figured out? You think you know what's going on? Where were you when I created this earth, this universe? Question number 2, hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. Do you know how big this thing is you're living on? Question number 3, where's the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where's the place thereof? Where'd the light come from? Where'd the darkness come from? Question number 4, by what way is the light parted, which scattereth in the east wind upon the earth? Question number 5, hath the rain a father, or who hath begotten the drops of dew? Question number 6, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. All you guys that are calling me into question, all of you guys that think you know better than me, all of you guys that are contending and arguing with me, let's debate. And then Job replies in chapter 40 and verse 4, behold, I am vile. You see, when you hear God's voice, when you learn about the greatness and the majesty of God, this is where you conclude. This is what you conclude. I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. It's time, Job said, for me to sit down. Let me say this nicely. My wife won't allow me to say this at home. And shut up. That's what he said. And there's coming a time when God will speak again. And the skeptics of this earth will sit down and be quiet. There's a second series of questions, and they're listed there. Behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth grass as an ox. Explain that one to me, he says. Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord, which thou lettest down? And so you guys think you have the power to deal with things and solve dilemmas. And well, let me give you 2 examples of creation that you have nothing that you can do to control. Look at chapter 42 and verse 1. Then Job answered the Lord. Here's Job's second response. I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood not. That statement really surmises or summarizes for us the thought of the secular age. I've uttered that which I understood not. People who attack the Bible and say it's full of inconsistencies and attack the God as the creator, or attack God's justice and God's righteousness based on their faulty premises. They don't know what they're talking about. And when you hear them with their Elihu spirit and their observation and dogma and experience and all their expertise, understand they don't know what they're talking about. Here I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I've heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. What happened through all of it? Job got a view of God. Job got a view of God. He said, I've heard of you, but now I see you. And that was the great blessing. Now, there are other blessings that are listed here, the bountiful blessings. Chapter 42, verses 7 through 17, that ends the book. Job is allowed to see the glory of God. He sees himself as God sees him, a sinner. No more Job defending himself. He's vindicated by God before the eyes of his 3 friends. God says these three guys thought they had it right and they had it wrong. He discovers the joy of praying for these three friends. You know, Jim Benny said something years ago that I've never forgotten. He said, it may be that the reason you're suffering from the hand of a certain person. In other words, there's somebody in your life that just, is a thorn in your flesh. He said, it may be that the reason that has happened is because you, unlike anyone else, knows more the need of that person and you need to pray for them. Who could have more effectively prayed for those three guys than Job? Nobody. Because Job had dealt with them for so long. And so those people that frustrate you and antagonize you may be opportunities that God is giving you to learn to pray for them. His former health is fully restored. He's comforted by his brothers and sisters. He's given double his former wealth. He's given 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. He lives to enjoy his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He lives 140 years afterwards, which is twice the lifespan and expectancy of man today, according to Psalm 90 and verse 10, when Moses said, 70, if by reason of strength 80. On the back, you'll see 6 reasons for Job's suffering. Number 1, that Satan may be silenced. Number 2, that Job might see God. Number 3, that Job might see himself. That Job's friends might learn not to judge. That Job might learn to pray for rather than to lash out against his critics. And to demonstrate that all God's plans for his children eventually have happy endings. Now, those 6 statements are statements that you ought to hold on to because they'll help you. And all of us have lived and are living in circumstances where we need these 6 statements. You see, God does multiple things in the lives of multiple people through one circumstance. He accomplishes many purposes. And so we can trust him. We can trust him. All right, we're wrapping up. Key verse is Job 42, verses 5 through 6. I've heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. 2 key words I'll leave you with: Redeemer, and suffer or suffering. Okay. I don't have time to give you this, but I'll tell you what I will do. I will put this in a little handout for you. But when you think about Christ in the book, he's all through it. He's all through it. And he is revealed to us through the questions of Job. G. Campbell Morgan wrote a great little devotional book called Jesus Answers Job. And he presents 8 questions, they're questions and declarations that Job makes in his arguments. Let me just give you one, okay? In Job 9:33, when he's talking to his friends, he said, there is no daysman betwixt us that might lay his hand upon us both. Job is dealing with the fact that he's on earth suffering and God is in heaven reigning and ruling. And Job knows that he cannot get to God. And Job said, I need a daysman. That word literally means mediator, who can lay his hand upon both of us, who can lay his hand upon a sinful man, and who can lay his hand upon a holy God. Any idea who the daysman is? Well, Paul tells us, doesn't he? There's one mediator between God and man, the man, Christ Jesus. Job said, I need a mediator. Jesus said, that's who I am. One more. Job 14:14, a great question, an age-old question. If a man die, shall he live again? That's a good question, isn't it? Jesus said in John 11:25, Job, I've got the answer. He that believeth on me, though he were dead, yet shall he what, church? He shall live. You see, Jesus answers Job. Oh, can I give you one more? I'm enjoying this too much. All right, one more, and this is it. I'm finishing. This is the last one. Job's making his argument. His friends are coming down on him. You have sinned. This wouldn't be happening to you. You must be a hypocrite. You must be a liar. You must be, the worst degree of whatever to get this much wrath poured out on you. And Job said in Job 16, verse 19, even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he that voucheth for me is on high. Wow. Everybody's pointing a finger at Job. You dirty, rotten bum. What's happened to you? You have really blown it. You've really sinned. You had us all fooled. You're a big hypocrite. And Job said, wait a minute. There's one in heaven who knows. And he voucheth. Don't you love that word? He voucheth for me. In Hebrews, the writer says, Christ has entered into heaven, not into the tabernacle made with hands, but into heaven itself, now to appear before God for us. Have you ever been in a situation where it just seemed like no matter what you did, no matter what you said, you couldn't untangle the mess? It didn't get any clearer. It only got worse. And you finally say, I can't straighten this out. Only God can. Well, Jesus Christ is our high priest. And he appeals to the Father on our behalf. And we can take great comfort in that, can't we? So when people frustrate you and circumstances come against you, you can rest in the Lord. He is your witness in heaven.